So let's begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
The Lord with you.
And with your spirit.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So, this class is going to be, the next three classes are going to be on just virtues. I love studying about the virtues, love praying for the virtues. But before I start, let's really start with some mocking. Today is Margot and Dawn's 50th anniversary. Congratulations. That's the virtue of perseverance. And it's also their anniversary, too. Now, the funny part is it's their 59th anniversary, and until you guys renewed their vows, their daughter had to remind them that today's their anniversary.
He doesn't remember.
So, I like to change up the adult ed from history to theology, apologetics, but actually spirituality is kind of one of my favorite things to study. But I think we need more emphasis on the virtues. And the virtues, to me, it's the difference between quantum physics and Newtonian physics. Like Newtonian physics, very good at getting rockets to the moon. But really, the odd part is the world works by quantum physics, not Newtonian physics. It's very small molecular forces that actually move the planets. That's the amazing part. And virtues are the same way. It's these small molecular virtues that really set the direction of our life. You think it's always the big things, but it's not. Or, in studying spirituality, it's like the difference of like trying to diagnose the cure for pneumonia by treating the cough. The cough is the most obvious problem, but that's not the real problem. That's just a symptom. The real problem is the pneumonia, which is far more hidden. It's a bacteria. The cure is dealing with a bacteria. And this sounds kind of strange, but for most of the problems in people's lives, it's really not the big solutions that matter. It's a small molecular one. And the Holy Spirit and the virtues, that's the thing that really moves the reality of our life. It's not the most obvious, but it's the things that matter the most. And I'll give you an example. I thought this was interesting. In England, they're having a lot of, like here, the politicians are locked. So this one group of politicians decided that, well, they're at this impasse, they're at loggerheads, and so they, in this strange thing, this member of the British Parliament took the suggestion that before that they have their arguments, that a group of them, that's all that agreed to meditate together. And what they found out is, I like this, where he said, after meditation, there's this affinity among those who they disagree with. And it changes the courses of disagreements. It's not that they stop disagreeing. It's just that they learn to disagree better, not harder, hotter. Like just a little bit of kindness changed everything. Virtues really change the directions of our lives. Unfortunately, if you look at like televangelists or some preachers, what really matters in the moral life is the moral rules and regulations. I would say that's not true. What first really matters is training yourself in the virtues. We use moral rules and regulations with kids because that's a really easy way to teach them morality. But if you train yourself in the virtues, you don't really need the moral rules and regulations. Eventually, the virtues govern you, and they'll happily be a part of you and guide you. And so Aristotle notes that, and I think this is true, some virtues we're just born with. But even if we're born with, we need to develop. Other virtues you do have to work with. So Christianity, we'd say, well, really the Holy Spirit is the source of all the virtues, but we have to train ourselves to be governed by the virtues rather than rules and regulations. That's a step of a deeper morality. The problem with morality based on rules and regulations, law, is that there's always loopholes or ways of defining things. Virtues really don't have loopholes. They simply become part of your soul. And positive psychologists to Aristotle and Socrates would say that it's the virtues that lead to happiness. Rules really don't lead to happiness, a good soul. And if you really want to hear what the Holy Spirit has to say in your life, the Holy Spirit speaks, but the words it uses are often virtues. So learning to listen to the Holy Spirit is like learning a new language, but the words of the language are the virtues. Being taught by the Holy Spirit does not mean, it's not like learning the catechism. Learning the virtues is a little bit different. You have to meditate on them and practice them until they become second nature. And I think too many people put their trust into catechetical answers, and if we just have rules of behavior, that'll clear things up, which still allow your ego to be in charge. To me, it's somewhat narcissistic because, having been in religion a while, sometimes when people are quoting canon law or the catechism, it's narcissistic of saying, look how smart I am. And I'm always kind of surprised when I find people can really quote canon law or the catechism, but their moral life is all screwed up because they haven't ever given up their ego. The Spirit, the Holy Spirit, demands that we give up our ego and let virtue start to control us. The virtues are in charge rather than our egos. And they did this study between intrinsic values and extrinsic values. If you're wondering, what are intrinsic values? Intrinsic values are things like love and loyalty and hope. Extrinsic values are things like money and cars and being sexually attractive. Now, what they found is that the two ways inhibit each other. So the more you concentrate on one, the other side goes down. If all your concern is about making sure that you're attractive, then the other virtues diminish. If you're really more concerned about virtues, your external values, need to have the best car, that all decreases. And millions are spent on advertising, convincing people that the external values are the most important. If you just had the latest iPhone, suddenly your kids would love you. And the odd part is 75% of people say that their intrinsic values, love, loyalty, humility, are the most important. And they say that, this is funny, other people's values are always extrinsic. So you get it. They say, oh no, I work by intrinsic values. Most people work by extrinsic values. Yet, when they measure those who say it's intrinsic values are most important, they don't spend most of their money that way or their time that way. Most people prove out that their extrinsic values are the most important, which I think is kind of funny. And yet, it's the intrinsic values that really govern your life. Give a small example. The virtue of awe, just to be awed at life, that sounds strange, but if you try and increase your awe, oddly enough, this study proved that your moral behavior increases. So these little molecular changes change the way your moral life goes. And sorry, but catechetical knowledge and moral rules and regulations, that's still external values. They're good, but they're not really as powerful as internal values. And so wisdom would say, you need to learn the virtues. So for the next 3 weeks, we're going to study the virtues. I like that. Everybody has strong and weak virtues. Like my strong virtue is a sense of rhythm and timing. Makes me a great dancer. Actually, I really am not a good dancer. I don't really care. I like dancing, but like the last time I danced was actually with Carol Meadows. What was that about? I don't know, 7 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't know why I went off on that, but like I would say kindness is not one of my strong virtues, one I need. Everybody has weak and strong virtues. But that sounds strange. This class is going to be on hope and hope in suffering. And hope is a very powerful virtue. The problem, and I'm going to ask if this makes sense because I'm never really sure if I'm getting through to people. But I think our current culture, we have a culture of hopelessness. And the opposite of hopelessness is what's called agency. And there's this, I forget what he is. He's one of famous writer, opinion piece, Jamel. And he did this interview that suddenly just woke me up, where he said, no, the culture he was raised in was a culture of hopelessness. He was raised in the East Coast. His father, he never really knew, raised by a single parent. His mother, who he loves, was really not interested. He was raised in a whole area where there's single parent, inner city. He listened a lot to hip hop music, and what he learned from hip hop music is to be hopeless, that the world is against you, you're always a victim. So his social culture taught him hopelessness through this hip hop music and the cultural chatter that the authority is always against you, the police is always against you, low parental involvement. And he was convinced by his culture that there is no agency, so why try? Agency is this power to decide your own destiny. The man is always against you, why try? You're always going to be a victim until everything in society changes. And what he learned is, what needs to change is something inside me. You don't wait for society. And if you're always a victim, then you never have any hope. Life is this endless hell. Oddly enough, those in hell, we say, have no hope. And I really do think he's right. A lot of the hip-hop music, it just inspires despair, that you're a victim, that you should be angry, so why try? The world is against you. And he makes this point that hopelessness takes away your sense of agency, where you lose the power to choose a better life. Your hope that hard work can make a difference evaporates. Hope that your abilities can set the direction of your life is never taught to you. And in his story, I think it's kind of interesting. He was raised by that, and the one response was anger, because the world is simply against you. So he said even as a teenager, he got into this thing of carrying a gun because, you have to be this badass because everybody is against you. And he thought that gave him power. And where his life changed was actually he met this teacher, and this teacher inspired him. And this teacher finally says to him, you're brilliant. You could go to Harvard if you wanted to. And that's the first time he ever even thought about going to college, that he could go to college. And it woke up that this idea of agency. I can govern my own life. I can choose college and Harvard. Well, I don't think he went to Harvard. I think he went to Columbia, but it doesn't really matter. He connects hopelessness with anger and sloth, because hopelessness leads to kind of this sloth. Why try? Why study? Why pray? Why not just distract yourself with video games or other disordered attachments? Sloth also is, I think, that's actually a child of hopelessness. Anger and sloth. And he said, and I really like this, he said, when he was hopeless, carrying the gun, he said he was hoping in the wrong things. That as a teenager, this image of being, kind of gangster punk, carrying a gun to make him feel powerful. He was hoping in all the wrong things. I think the same thing happens to us. Like, even Thomas Aquinas says, people hope in the wrong image of God. But Jamal is right, that hope is connected to agency, and hopelessness is really why try? You're always a victim. And he kind of made my eyes open up that, yeah, our culture, some parts of our culture, it teaches the next generation to be hopeless. Be angry, but don't have agency. Does that make sense, or did I lose anybody? I did lose you? No. Good, I can have a cup of coffee. Yes.
Buzz somehow?
Yes.
You what?
You don't hear
There's
the
a
buzz?
buzz.
Feedback?
Oh, no.
Way to get rid of it?
Well, yeah, you could be like me and have poor hearing. I don't know, is that any better?
Yes.
Is it more of a velvety voice? Okay, so that makes sense about hope and agency, because hope also gives power to your will. It's the teacher that inspired him. And what it gave him is a different sense of power than covering a gun. Hope is agency. We'd say it's a gift from God that you can train yourself for, because he actually does. But you can also inspire other people. Of all the virtues, we'd say it's a theological virtue, which means it comes from God. You can't just, it doesn't come from any other source. Your money, your wealth, your beauty, physical training, it really won't give you hope. So I do believe Jamel is right, that there are sources or influences that starve the oxygen of hope, and you need to avoid those. Now, here's the odd part. Those in hell have no hope. So why try? Why not just be angry? But oddly enough, those in heaven also have no hope. But that's because they're already in the very presence of love. They're exactly where hope leads. And so here's a question. So do you think our culture does or does not teach hopelessness? Just curious.
I think the politicians play.
Yeah, but I also think there's cultural influences, the music, the video games. But here's the thing: hope is also known as defiance, and I like that. And I'll give you an example. In Sarajevo, because you can say circumstances, but you remember during the in Sarajevo the Herzegovina Civil War. In Sarajevo, there is one bread store left open. And as people would line up, one dressed up musician with a cello would show up and start playing to the people in line. And he did it day after day as this act of defiance against all the violence in their circumstances. And he wanted to give them something more important than bread, and that was hope. Everything in Sarajevo was teaching the people hopelessness. So he wanted his music to be this act of defiance that somehow would ignite a little bit of hope in them. Now, he does survive. Oddly enough, he just thought he'd be shot. But in this act of defiance, he plays the cello. He does survive, and Yo-Yo Ma at one of his concerts pulls him out. And he gave this thing where he said he never liked the definition of hope that's grounded in the future. Like, if we could just wait 10 years, then we'll have hope. He decided hope has to be right here and now. So I thought that was brilliant, because my predictions of the future are always inaccurate. I always buy a lottery ticket and always fail. My grounding of hope is not in my future circumstances, but it's really about my relationship with God. This celloist, his circumstances, everything taught him that life should be hopeless. Everybody was. his hope was this act of defiance. So the amazing part is, yeah, you can say it's circumstances, but why is it other people have this theological connection that can't be conquered by circumstances? Circumstances neither give you hope or take away hope. That's some agency of your own spirit. And kind of the person I consider the most, who studied the most on hope, is actually Viktor Frankl. And if you don't know who Viktor Frankl was, he was this Jew that during World War II was put in the concentration camps. But he was a psychologist. And in this odd way, he survives the concentration camp and then writes about it. And he writes about man's search for meaning. And he notes how people survive the concentration camp, and he puts them into 4 categories. And the first category is how people respond. First, there's those who respond with brutality, where he said some people reacted to be as brutal as the Nazis themselves. Former people who used to be friends and sociable and be friendly began to behave to others with the same brutality that the Nazis showed them. And he said they did not survive. That's just a very cynical way of relating to the world. So one is react with brutality. Secondly, he said there's those who simply gave in to resignation. And he said some people just shriveled up and die. One day they would refuse to eat or bathe, and without any hope, they would simply die. So that's the second category. First, people without hope, they can act with brutality. Second, people without hope, they simply shrivel up and die. The third is what he called power and status. And some people believe that one day they would regain their wealth and their status, their families would come back if they could just endure the war. And oddly enough, many of those people actually did survive. But after they were released and realized their wealth and their status and their wife and their kids are permanently lost, they did not survive. And so he said they put their hope in the wrong thing. And it's dangerous to confuse hope and optimism. Optimism can be a dangerous way of simply ignoring reality. If you make your wife, your home, your status, your ultimate home, when you end up defeated and they're permanently lost, you won't survive. You can say, but I'll never end up in a concentration camp. What do you think life is? It's the ultimate concentration camp. Seriously, look at your wedding photos. You're not the same. If you live long enough, all those things that gave you status and power will be slowly taken away. We're really living in a very slow motion concentration camp. If your joy is your circumstances, then you really don't have joy. That's actually from the letter of St. Peter. Most people think that their hope is their circumstances. But let's face it, the longer you live, everything will be slipping away. And you realize that. You don't want to make hope your circumstance. So that's a third category. People who make their hope their circumstances. Whether, like, someday I'll get my wife or my wealth or my hair back. It's not coming back. Don't make hope your circumstance. And he said, the fourth category is, he said, those who had meaning. And so Frankl connects the source of hope with meaning. Those who maintained a sense of freedom and liberty, they had a meaning to their life. They were able to endure because meaning gave them hope. And so Frankl noticed those who made finite things their hope, they didn't endure. But meaning is not finite. And I even like the story where it has this one Jew scrubbing toilets, and the Nazi guard says, "Where is your God now?" And the Jew says, "Right here with me." Like, not even the worst circumstances could take away his connection with God. That gave him meaning. People have various sorts of meanings, but what Frankl noticed about hope and suffering, I think applies today. Notice people today still react in the same way. Some people, when they feel hopeless, they react with brutality. Look at the mass shootings. That seems to be coming out week after week after week. Isn't it shocking? You have all these dystopic movies and mass shootings. Their reaction to the world is to be as brutal as the Nazis. Look at Jamel's reaction. His reaction was, since there's no hope, he's carrying a gun and going to be the biggest badass he can. Thank God he didn't stay that way. The second category, resignation, still alive today. We have the highest rate of suicide and depression. That's Frankl's resignation. Does that make sense? Third category, materialism. That's what a lot of Americans put their hope in. And materialism takes a whole bunch of forms, like plastic surgery. If being beautiful is your hope, the truth is we're all fading away. And it's kind of pathetic to see people hang on to things that are finite. Even like beauty, I know that sounds strange, but you start to hang on to something with finiteness that's finite, and it contorts your image, whatever that is. Like, take beauty or plastic surgery. Sorry if I'm embarrassing anybody in here. He's had a lot of plastic surgery. But, like, did you, must have been just 59 years of giggles, right? But, like, I hate to be cruel, but there's a woman who works out of my gym who has excessive plastic surgery. And I'm always kind of staring at her face because, like, it just doesn't, I can't put my finger on it, but there's just something, like, the duck lips, and, like, it just looks contorted. It's not even beautiful. And she doesn't have a wrinkle, but it looks so weird. It just doesn't look natural. And you end up becoming this parody of beauty. Not beauty itself, it's a parody. And those who put their hope in things that are finite, whether it's power or wealth or sex, they never really become their true selves. They just become this parody. Not just the woman who uses too much plastic surgery, but even like a priest who's obsessed with power. I've known some priests that get obsessed with power, and early on, you don't notice it. But later on in life, they're obsessed by power, and they become these parody of what a priest should be, not a true person. Speaking of which, do you want to hear my joke about plastic surgery? Yes. No offense. So this this one woman was just obsessed by the fear of dying. So she prayed and prayed and prayed, and finally God had enough and told her in a dream, listen, you're not going to die for decades and decades. Just stop worrying about death. So finally she's free from it, but she kind of thinks, well, if I'm going to be around here a while, I better get some plastic surgery and look good. So she gets from toe to head the whole thing redone. Steps out of the hospital and gets hit by a car. So she goes up to heaven and she says to God, you said I wasn't going to die for decades. And God said, well, yeah, that was a plan, but I didn't recognize you. But like in this odd thing, you hold on to finite things and you stop looking like your true self. Not just plastic surgery, but the priest that is obsessed by power. Or, I hate to tell you this, one of my friends, God bless him, used to work for Homeland Security, so kind of military type person. he's 59 years old and he just got a 20-year-old girlfriend, you look ridiculous. We just don't have the nerve to tell him. Like, that could be your granddaughter, for love of God. You look ridiculous. And now that he's retired, he wants to act like that. You're a parody of a true human being. I'm just saying that's the third category of putting your hope in finite things. You know, we have the highest suicide rate of any wealthy country. Wealthier countries allow one to have this optimism that life should always be happy and beautiful. But if you're born into a poor country, you don't expect life to be happy or beautiful. But you're not cheated. It can be meaningful. This is Frankl's third type that I think is part of the American ethos. The fourth is meaning and hope. St. Paul says we're born into a living hope. I love that line. We're born into a living hope. The living hope, of course, is God. That can't be ever taken away. That's a theological virtue because circumstances never matter. You want to put your hope in something that won't ever give up. And so how do you do that? That's my question. Well, I think there's a lot of things. One is that first, we really do have to learn to give up false hopes, as Frankl said. Hoping in the wrong thing is very dangerous. You love the wrong person and it's self-destruction. You hope to become a Kardashian, you'll just be dead to life. Hoping in a better life is great, to rise from poverty and get an education, hardworking. But like Gilgamesh, you have to find a better hope. Oh, do you know who Gilgamesh is? Gilgamesh, first story of humankind ever written down is the story of Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's our most ancient story, which I like, that's ever written down. And the story of Gilgamesh is, I'll give you the edited version. He's this king who, his friend dies. His best friend dies, and he's like, well, what's the use of life? And so he spends his life trying to find, well, what makes for a happy life? And so he says, well, I'm going to have it with booze and women. Well, that doesn't work out. And then he tries ambition, and that doesn't work out. And the last thing he finds is that what gives life meaning is to care for other people. It's a great kind of story that the meaning of life, that's where you find hope. Like Gilgamesh, I think people have to try different things, but you hope that you find the source of hope, which is meaning. And that's caring for others. There's also I'll give it up. So sometimes this sounds kind of strange. To find hope, you need to give up the false hopes. So sometimes I think a little bit of depression is actually a very good thing. Maybe it's a sign that you have to give up certain hopes and love that just aren't working anymore. If your identity will stay your identity until some other experiences pushes up against it, and whether that experience be pain or good, you'll still keep holding on to it. You have to be able to find true hope. You have to question your own life and say, is this false hope? And it takes some effort there. Also, and this sounds kind of strange, but there's this connection, I think, for us Catholics between hope and ritual. Not just giving up false hopes, but also inspiring us with true hope. And I'll take this example from the Jews. The Jewish people distinguish between optimism and hope. Optimism is, everything always works out, pretty soon technology will happen and everybody will be happy. That's not hope. So the Jews are kind of have lost this easy optimism, really, that everything's going to work out. Because do you want me to explain in brief every single Jewish feast? Doesn't matter what it is. Passover, first fruits, Yom Kippur, Hanukkah, Purim. The feast is this. Every Jewish feast is, they hated us, they tried to kill us, we survived. Let's thank God. So for 4,000 years, there's been all these attempts of genocide. And they understand in their own history how tragic the world can be. That doesn't mean you need to lose hope. So Jews, the custom of lighting candles, and I mention this because this is our custom. Remember, the Sabbath starts with the lighting of the candles, where the mother lights the candle and presses the light to her eyes. That's actually this act of defiant hope that the world is dark, but we can light a candle and press it to our eyes. Without hope, they would never have survived 4,000 years, the black hole of history. The lighting of the Sabbath candles is their way of reminding that those who see hope can transmit them to the next generation. So once a week, it starts with this act of defiance that despite all the darkness in the world, we want light in our eyes to see the world differently. Just as every Jewish feast, every lighting of a candle is this act of hope, so is every Catholic celebration. We have candles, but one of the things the lighting of the candles is for us is also this act of hope. Actually, and people get surprised at this, the Sabbath starts at sundown. So people get confused, and sometimes they'll say the Saturday night Mass is the Vigil Mass. That's not a Vigil Mass. That's a Sunday Mass. Sunday starts at sundown. So the Jewish idea, there's more of this, but the Jewish idea is this. When the world is dark, that's when you need faith. That's when you need to light the candle of hope. So actually, the Sabbath begins at sundown with the lighting of the candle. And we would say as Catholics, all the sacraments really are supposed to transmit hope to the next generation. Does that make sense? Okay, so then you have to define, well, what is hope? But the problem is, hope is really hard to define. Because people use the word hope a lot, and that's not hope, that's optimism. And there's one theologian, she's a woman, I love her definition of hope, so I have to tell her story. Her name's Darcy, and Darcy, when she was in her 20s, she had 2 kids, she was happily married, no, take that back. She had 1 child, a little girl, and then she was pregnant with another girl. And they're leaving someplace, and this drunk T-bones the car, kills her husband and the little girl. She's taken to the hospital. She delivers the baby, but she survived and the little girl survived. But she lived with incredible depression. I mean, she was Catholic, but very depressed. And she lived with that depression. And then one day somebody comes to visit from the parish, and they're talking to her. And they mentioned a young mother who died of cancer, and tells her this story that the father, who's a young father, told this person. So the story goes, she died. After the funeral, the little boy and the father, they get into bed after the reception. They go to bed. The father's going to sleep with the son. And the father tells the son, you can ask me whatever questions you want, because he kind of wants to work this through with his son. And so his son asks him just really obvious questions, like, well, who's going to wake me up in the morning? Well, I'll have to wake you up. Well, who's going to make my lunch? Well, I won't have time to make your lunch. Your mom's not here to make your lunch. You'll have to take a hot lunch. Well, who's going to be here to greet me when I come home? Well, you're going to have to go into aftercare because I'm working. Your mom's not here. So every answer is a bad answer. Your mom's not here. She can't do that anymore. We'll have to, every answer's a bad answer. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So finally, he's just exhausted. And he says to his son, uh, you can ask me more questions in the morning, but we have to get some sleep. So he says, okay. So the father turns off the light, and when he turns off the light, the room is pitch dark. And pretty soon he hears his son say, Dad, are you facing towards me or away from me? And his dad says, I'm facing towards you. And then his son says, well, then everything will be okay. Now, here's the odd part. That doesn't answer any of the horrible questions of who's going to be there when he gets home. But that's a great definition of hope. So when Darcy hears this story that this little kid just believed that there's this face in the darkness that wished him nothing but love, she realized that's what I'm missing. Yes, she was Catholic, but she really didn't have hope. She didn't really believe God is this face in the darkness that wants nothing but love for her. Because all Darcy's answers are terrible. Her husband's dead. Her child is dead. She's a single mother with this child. And so she actually rebuilds her world through theology. And she studies theology, but she becomes a theological writer and teacher. And she's kind of known as this theologian of hope. But I really like it. She had a search for the face in the darkness. And so she said, hope is a face in the darkness. I love this. But she also says, hope is illogical. Finding hope can really be that simple. If you feel that God is this source of love, this face that seems to have, this face that is always turned towards you, you're able to move through life. If you feel that the face is turned away from you, that all you have is judgment or absence, then you have no hope. The Old Testament says, Israel's hope is Yahweh. Israel's hope is not politics or power or logic. Abraham, he says his promise is hope. It's illogical for a 100-year-old man to have a child. God never makes it easy. Joseph in the Bible. You know the story of Joseph in the Bible? Think about this. He's this great symbol of hope. His brothers throw him in a pit. And it's awful when you read the story. He's yelling to his brothers, let me out. You can't let me die. That's exactly what they intend to do. He's stuck in this pit, and there's no way out. Well, then there's traders, and they decide rather than let him die, they'll trade him for money. So then he's thrown into slavery. And he's thrown into slavery. He's working in this general's house, and then he gets accused of sexual harassment, which could be murder. You know that story, like the wife wanted a little something, something, and Joseph said he didn't believe in free love. So she accuses him, and this is a powerful general. And he gets thrown into jail. So once again, he's back in the pit. He's thrown into jail to die, and it's kind of the story of Jesus. There's two people he meets, cupbearer and who's a butler, and a baker. And he tells them their dreams. One dream is the guy's going to die. The other dream he's going to be raised up back with Pharaoh. And it happens just as he says. 3 days later, this guy dies. The cupbearer is released and is back with Pharaoh. And Joseph says to him, don't forget me when you go into Pharaoh's house. Well, the guy did. He spends another 2.5 years in jail, in prison. And then one day, you know the story, Pharaoh has this dream. Joseph can interpret the dream. Joseph rises up to be the second in command. Joseph, and now I'm just going off on this, Joseph knows what the dream means. 7 good years, 7 bad years. So Joseph, his gift is administration. So he says, we'll take 1/5 of this, we'll take 1/5 of this, so that eventually in 7 years, we'll be able to feed our people and the world will come begging for us. Pharaoh becomes enormously wealthy and powerful because the world has to come to Pharaoh for food. And Pharaoh, Joseph's brothers have to come. And Joseph has this great theology where he says to his brothers eventually, no, all these things happened so that I could save the family. Like, that's a strange look. Like, being thrown in prison, being thrown in the pit, being accused of sexual harassment. The one thing Joseph had, is that could never be taken away, was hope and faith and love. So we'd say, well, hope is this incredible power. The story is that hope, faith, and love, they're really the most powerful things. Not even the worst circumstances. And how do you know out of the worst circumstance, you're not going to save the entire family? So the word for hope or love or faith in Hebrew, they have all the same root. And the idea is that they're really all different sides of the same thing. And I like that, because if you explain it through Darcy's way, that hope is connected with love, that you believe that there's this face in the darkness that wants nothing but love for you. Hope, faith, and love, they're all the same thing. Hope is not a matter of sitting down and rationalizing what's the logical course of action. I'm all for logic. But if you have some rational reason for hope, that's not hope. That's ration. That's logic. Hope is a face in the darkness. It doesn't have a reason. And this sounds kind of strange. You meet people all the time who they'll say, oh, I have hope because I'm pretty sure this chemotherapy will work. Chemotherapy, I'm not against it, but that's a finite thing. That's not really hope. That's optimism. Or they'll say, well, we're pretty sure a new treatment will come out soon. That's not really hope. That's optimism. Does that make any sense? A lot of people, if they really confuse logic and hope. Even in the United States, you always hear, well, don't worry, technology will improve and then we'll be free from these problems. It'll just come up a different way. Hope, like faith and love, is a grace that we can't produce, but we get to participate in. It's really from God. So hope is illogical. I'll say that. And Darcy's right. Hope is illogical. So is love. And they did this study with people that are depressed. And here's the odd part. People who are depressed are not being illogical. That's the odd part. They're being super rational. And so it's really hard to argue with somebody who's depressed, because their problem is not that they're not being logical. The problem is that they're being too logical. And it's called the crack in the wall theory. Do you guys know this? Mm-hmm. Okay, so imagine you have this house and this is our wall, but there's a little bit of crack in the wall. But other than that, the house is fine. You'll survive. Somebody's depressed. All they see is the crack in the wall. They don't see the rest of the house. So if you argue about the crack, they're going to win. They're not being illogical. They're being too logical. That's all they see is a crack. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Hope allows you to see, yeah, there is a crack, but there's so much more. You don't put trust in that. So even Darcy would say that the reason why she was so hopeless is that she was being too logical. And she really didn't believe in this face in the darkness that had her, wished her nothing but love. The other thing is that hope and suffering, they're kind of connected. In suffering, you know this. Suffering will either embitter people or they make them better. Hope allows people to endure. And so like Desmond Tutu, he writes this book on hope. You know who Bishop Desmond Tutu was? Apartheid. He writes this book on hope where he had hope all through apartheid. And he tells us one story, and I think this is a great image of hope, where they're in this worship celebration, and the government is cracking down. So suddenly the secret police show up with machine guns and literally surrounded them in a circle with machine guns. And Desmond Tutu, he laughs and he says, come join us. He says, no, please join us. We will win this. You know, eventually, we will win. You're already defeated and you don't know it. Like, isn't that a great line? You're already defeated and you don't know it. He has no gun. He has no political power. And he's saying to the people with machine guns, you've lost. And you don't even know you've lost. Why not come and enjoy the celebration? That is just defiant hope. And no matter how things got, the worse they got, the stronger the hope. That's a really odd one. Or Nelson Mandela. He writes about Nelson Mandela sentenced unjustly to break apart big rocks into little rocks. And even Nelson Mandela realized he's got to change. He can't live with this anger or he will be defeated. Every time you look at the cross, it's a symbol of really hopelessness and hope. That suffering can't overcome hope. So we're supposed to live under the power of hope. It cannot be defeated. We've already won. And hope allows us to be part of a greater plan. And Darcy tells a small story, it's unrelated, where Darcy is flying back to Washington, D.C. to be with family, and there's this hellish plane trip that she gets bumped around and is missing kind of this family reunion. But she gets bumped and nothing is going right. She is sitting next to this young girl who looks upset. And so finally she asks the young girl, is there something wrong? And the young girl says, well, her father just died and she's going to the funeral, and says, do you know anything about hope? And so Darcy, when they get off into Washington, D.C., delivers her into the arms of her family. But she said, I was allowed to participate in a greater plan. I didn't really have to tell her about the loss of my husband and my first child. I was there to be an instrument of hope. And I like how you could be, if you see the world with hope, you also see that you're part of a larger plan. That Darcy thinks, she was actually meant to be on that plane. God doesn't exist to serve our plans. We exist to serve God's plan. In Darcy, it starts with this face in the darkness, and then hope moves to this idea that I get to be part of God's plan of helping people in the world. That's not a finite good, that's an infinite good. That's a meaning. So Frankl is right. Hope comes from meaning, not from logic. Now the problem is, if we hope in something that we can control, whether it's wealth or beauty or power, that's false hope. And the problem is, I think really in our culture, we don't believe that God is stronger than our military or money or health care. We trust in those things first rather than God. We'll hope in God once all our safeties are in place. Once God really explains how this is all going to turn out for good, then we'll trust in God. But that's the kid who, that's not the kid who simply believes that there's a face in the darkness that wishes us nothing but good. And so I want to just mention this. So with hope and suffering, here's the odd part. They test out people who test high on hope. And the odd part, people who test high as being hopeful also can endure more pain. Where they give them this pain test. If you have a lot of hope in your life, oddly enough, and it's a pretty clear statistic, your level of pain endurance is much higher. So I don't think hope conquers suffering, but like Nelson Mandela laughing at machine guns, it allows a certain defiance in the face of suffering. Tutu, sorry, you're right. God, for a lot of plastic surgery, his brain still works. So then the question, this is going to get into discussion, how do you increase hope? So one, I would say prayer. Intimacy with divine, if it's maintained, it increases hope. They did a study on that. I find it true. That's why I think you can't just wait till the car accident to start praying. It's amazing. Like even yesterday, almost every week this happens to me, where I'm called to the hospital and this guy, I like the guy. It's not a question of like her, but he is dying. He says he's dying. Like, he's Catholic, but he said, I don't think I've been in the Catholic Church since I was a kid. He says, I really gave up on God. But he said, now I need you to pray for me. Well, I will pray for you. But it's kind of like starting a car in fifth gear. Like, it's years of prayer and spirituality that pull you through the hard time. You can't just start it once the car accident happens. So, I don't know, people who meditate regularly and pray regularly, they have a higher hope. Secondly, I do think you need a community that will pass on hope. The same way the Jews have been lighting candles for 4,000 years and we've been lighting them for 2,000 years, you can't pass on what you don't have. And I do think Thomas Aquinas is right. Some Christian communities, what they pass on is hopelessness, if you look at their theology of God. I always think, like, people will say, oh, you know, my grandson doesn't really ever go to church, but don't worry, he believes in God. Big deal that they believe God exists. I believe China exists. It doesn't make me Chinese. Like, to belong to a community that believes hope is more powerful than any circumstances in life. Like, even Darcy said she cut herself off from going to church. She became isolated, and what she needed was community. Thank God somebody from the parish showed up and told a story. But you need a community to maintain hope. Thirdly, you need communal rituals. You need to worship together. Fourth, I think you have to confront your fears. Positive psychology has actually found that to be true. Hope and fear cannot occupy the same space. So you have to invite one in. And there's one of the founders of positive psychology said, what he discovered is most people, the reason their life is not blooming is because of fear. And he's this New York psychologist, old guy now, but he's hilarious because if you come to him, he makes you conquer your fear. Before we work on your problem of X, if you have a lot of fear in your life, you have to have hope. If you're going to work on whatever problem he has, you have to work on hope and you have to get rid of fear. So he has people do these really weird exercises. And where, like, they have to be comfortable with whatever they fear. So if you, like, fear people judging you, he actually makes people get on the subway and announce the stop beforehand. Sorry, my pants. And so it's like, Lincoln City, or Lincoln Circle, that's what it is. Lincoln Circle, everybody off for Lincoln Circle. And nobody ever does it. Like, nobody ever tells them to shut up or anything. But like, you get comfortable with your greatest fear. I think that's actually kind of brilliant, where, hope and fear can't occupy the same space. So invite one in and kick one out. And Charles Darwin, I like this. Charles Darwin said, if the flight feathers are damaged on a goose, it will walk its path to achieve its goal. And here's the odd part. So human beings, maybe we're meant to be incredibly hopeful people. Maybe we're supposed to be like a goose, that even if our flight feathers are damaged, we always respond with hope. So to do that, we can't let fear overcome us. And positive psychology would say a lot of people, they don't really thrive because they're more controlled by fear than hope. That's 4. 5, remove all false hopes. Like, that takes a lot of self-examinations. What are the false hopes? Like Gilgamesh, you have to be able to look at your life and say, oh no, this is silly and this is silly. Time to give that up. This sounds strange, but 6 is, and I thought of this because of Jamel. Jamel said the music he listened to taught him hopelessness. Like, I think you have to be really careful what kind of even music you listen to. And this gets into art. And the music you listen to, the stories that you read. Sean Aker, who's a positive psychologist, would say, even the stories you read, if the stories of in your spare time, movies or video games, is always about losing agency, you need to give that up. Does that make sense? So that, I'd say, 6 is, oh, sorry. No, sorry. 6 is about the power of story. 7, what gives your life meaning? This takes a lot of, what does give your life meaning? Once again, it's usually a connection or sense of purpose. We actually have a whole sacrament for that. It's called confirmation. Confirmation is praying and anointing over these kids that their life has a purpose, that God gave them gifts just for them to be returned back to the community, that their life has a meaning. It changes throughout your life, but what's the meaning in your life? In 7, just some exercises. So before I get to the exercises, feedback, opinions, objections.
Could you talk about agency? And I think I understand what you mean, in that it's our own person and how we feel about it.
I can make choices as agency. I have control, not complete, but when the teacher said, you can go to Harvard, that's the first time he ever realized a sense of agency. I could do that. Okay, so here's the questions. Discuss them at your table. Oh, wait, Jane?
Agency like community.
What's that?
Agency like community.
Not really. Agency is this power in you that you can do something, that I can choose a life. You're not a victim. You're not a victim, Jane. Okay, so here's some questions. Name things in your experience that taught you hopelessness. And discuss these at your tables. Name what or who taught you how to hope. Like Jamel said, it was that teacher that inspired him, first with a sense of agency. Who in your life taught you hope? And then lastly, the question is, who have you taught hope to? Because you're supposed to pass it on to the next generation. Darcy, she tried to pass it on theologically, teaching to other people. So, who taught you hope? Who taught you hope, or what taught you hopelessness? And who do you teach hope to? So talk about it, and then we'll discuss it. I'll eat a donut.